Hello tribe, today I want to talk to you about assessing overcontrol because I think this is something which is really important for us as clinicians to try and understand a little bit more of. I know in my experience this was an area which I found really difficult because it was hard for me to try and identify some of those small nuances of overcontrol versus undercontrol. I have spoken previously about overcontrol versus undercontrol, so that can be quite useful to understand. But in particular, I want to focus on actually assessing and identifying these clients. There are a couple of really straightforward strategies and approaches we can take to this, but I think it's really important to be aware that sometimes it will take a long time to try and get this right. I do know that when Tom and his team are talking, sometimes they do have to try and nut out, is this person over control or under control? And sometimes it's not as simple as yes, definitely, or no, not at all, because obviously there is some overlap in behaviour and trying to understand whether a particular behaviour is an under control behaviour or emotional leakage. But we'll get to that. So the main thing is to be aware that there are a couple of steps towards assessing over control, and these are outlined in the RO-DBT manual. So that can be a really useful one to look at. And it starts off with scales. So I suppose the very first thing to try and focus on in regards to our assessing over control is trying to focus on some of the scales that are in the manual. The very first one is our word pairs checklist to try and identify which side the person tends to lean to. I've generally found that this is relatively accurate. It's never going to be completely accurate, but I've generally found that what people are going to mark on this word pairs checklist, whichever column has more, tends to be a relatively good demonstration about whether this person tends to lean over control or under control. So the word pairs checklist can be quite helpful. A question that comes up quite frequently with the word pairs checklist is a question about, whether some of the words are seen as negative, but people aren't going to want to pick a certain word because there's the negative connotations associated with that particular word. And I think that is a really good concern, but I think it also at the same time there are words like that on both sides, both in the column A and column B, over control or under control. And I think that simply saying, a lot of them are negative in the over control is oversimplifying it, because I think that it's not that simple. There's some on both sides that are. And in addition to that, I think it's also personal bias. For people who are under control may be more likely to see a lot of the under control words as positive or something that they're happy with, whereas they may be words that people who are lean under control aren't so happy with. So I think that that's a really important way of looking at it. So there are definitely words that someone who is over control would find more appealing than someone who's under control, and so they're going to endorse that. So I think that the word pairs checklist is a really good place to start, and it's quite a short, simple one that can be done quite easily with our clients when they're new or when they're entering groups. There are two other self-report measures that quite often are recommended. So they're the personal needs structure questionnaire and the acceptance and action questionnaire, which are both really easily available. And both of those sort of give you a little bit of an idea about how the person is leaning as well. So when we've got our checklists and our, I suppose, pencil and paper tests, it's also really important to look into the actual clinical interview. So actually meeting with the client is probably one of the best ways to get to know whether they are over control or under control, as it is the best way of identifying the diagnosis for the particular client. So one of the things to be aware of here is, first of all, the diagnosis, what comes up. There are some disorders which are quite stereotypically over control, such as our clinical depression, anorexia nervosa, autism, as well as our access to disorders, so our obsessive compulsive personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder. So if you're finding that these clients are meeting criteria for that, there is a really good chance that they are leaning towards the over control side. In addition to that, it's also really important as an interviewer that we ask about how the client displays the behaviours that they're actually talking about, because it is very easy for someone to be assumed to be, say, borderline personality when they're actually over control, because the client will feel that they're out of control and the client will feel that their emotions are huge and all over the place, but they don't actually display it, or that isn't actually shown to the world. So really important questions to supplement there are things like, how would you describe yourself? What might I see you do? If someone says that their emotions are all over the place, we can ask them, how would I be able to tell? If I was there, what would I see you do? And if the client is able to say, well, you probably wouldn't say anything, it's all private, then that is going to give you a good clue that you might have someone who's over control. So the diagnostic part of the interview is really important, as is the display of these behaviours. There are a number of supplemental questions that are available in the manual, such as, do you see yourself as a perfectionist? Are you slow to warm up? Does it take a little while to get to know you? Asking some of those personal questions to sort of make sense of how that person is going. From there is a clinician rating system in the manual as well, which is really helpful to sort of try and understand what's happening for that client. It's really important that we familiarise ourselves with that before using it, because some of the things we may as clinicians not pick up during the clinical interview or during meeting them, and therefore it's going to be really important to actually make sense of that so you know what you're looking for in the actual session. So that's the Overcontrol Global Prototype Rating Scale. And if a client achieves 17 or over based on the clinician's rating, then we can do the subtype rating scale to talk about disagreeable or agreeable. But that's something for a whole other discussion. So from our rating scale, there's also an assessor global scale, I suppose. So the clinician rated OC trait rating scale. So that's a really, really good way of going through that and making sense of whether that person is leaning over control or under control. So through all of these particular things, we are getting an idea, hopefully by this stage, of whether the client is over control or under control. Obviously, there's always going to be a little bit of confusion or concern or not too sure about it, but with all of those things together, it is quite helpful. The questions that I often find come out is that is a lot of an assessment for one person. Yes, I agree, it can be, but it depends on what we have and the, I suppose, resources that we have and the time that we have. Because some of it is the rating scales that the clinician does afterwards, it's not necessarily having to worry about taking up assessment time doing it. And it's the way in which we ask the client in session as well. So I think that it can sound like a lot, but it is really important to be aware that a lot of it is our reflection on the client afterwards that can give us that idea. So some things that I've found really helpful in my experience personally to try and help beef this up or make a little bit more sense of it is I suppose, how we're actually looking at this. One thing that I've noticed a bit of a pitfall was we're not just looking at perfectionistic traits. Everyone has at least some of those. Even as an under control person, I do know that I can be a little bit perfectionistic at times. There are definitely times when I do things right or properly, and I am very organised. And a lot of people looking at me might assume that I do have some over-control traits there because of that. So we do need to be aware that even our most borderline client or our most under-control client is likely to have some perfectionistic traits. It might have a lot of perfectionistic traits. So it's not as simple as to just say, oh, you're a perfectionist, you're over-control. Possibly, but it is something that we need to be a little bit more critical about. In addition, it's also really helpful to look for evidence of biotemperament. So this is, again, another discussion will happen another time, but we are looking for that high emotional sensitivity, high threat sensitivity, and low reward sensitivity, as well as our I suppose, specific focus processing, the way in which a client cognitively processes something. So these are all things that we're really looking for as part of this. If a client you find gets really excited about lots of things and really enjoys going to parties and enjoys this and enjoys that and seems to actually have a high reward sensitivity, they may not necessarily be over control. Whereas if a client doesn't experience that much reward unless they've achieved something, then possibly more over control. So we are trying to look for the evidence of the biotemperament. And in that, it's really useful to look at the biosocial theory in general, because trying to understand some of the early childhood and how parents may have influenced our behaviour and development is another really helpful way of understanding that. The last little tip that I like to add into that is actually noticing the in-session behaviour, because how the client sits, how the client behaves, how the client responds to you will give you a good clue about whether they're more leaning over control or under control. So a client who will answer questions with vague responses or really short responses, or say, oh, that's a hard question, I don't know, and those sorts of things may be more likely to be over control. I also found that clients who'll sit really forward on their chairs if they want to run away, possibly more over control. Clients who will mask their expression or I suppose smile or dismiss when they're talking about really negative events, like, oh, it's not a big deal, whatever, it's fine, or being really sarcastic about them, might also be more over control. So it is really important to be aware of that in-session behaviour as well. A really important thing to remember is that over-control clients do bring their perceptual and regulatory biases into situations with them, and that includes the session. So you are probably going to be triggered or react in some way to how the client is presented. So whether that be tensely or anxiously, or just generally not feeling comfortable with something, if you're feeling like the client's really strongly judging you, etc., there might be clues that, well, they're clues to look out for as a clinician anyway, but definitely a place to look back and say, well, where was that coming from? What was that happening there? So they are some really important things to be aware of. The last couple of important things that I wanted to make you aware of is it's hard to be in control all the time. So we do need to be aware of emotional leakage. It is something that does happen with these clients, in that there is an emotion, they try to shove all their emotions down, and it's going to come out somewhere. So there's going to be some emotional leakage. And so it's really important to be aware of that emotional leakage. And over-control clients are also likely to engage in behaviours that might look under-controlled, such as self-harm, binging, purging, anger outbursts. But some of these behaviours are more likely to be planned. Particularly self-harm, I've noticed, is quite often more planned. So we'll be done, I'm going to have a stressful week, so I'm going to cut in advance, or I'm going to put it off until the end of the week, as opposed to that instantaneous gratification. And same with binging. So that's one thing to be aware of, is that it's more likely to be planned. And I've often noticed, and this is just my experience, it may not be a global thing, but clients with over-control are more likely to say cut upper arms and more subtle places than the client with under control. So they're really important things to be aware of. So as well as that, there's quite a few scripts in the manual about self-identifying as over-control and biosocial model, etc. The actual script to try and help someone self-identify as over-control is actually a really good way, because even if you're confused about where they might lean, the client might be able to understand that actually I do lean this way, or I lean the other way. So that's the last part of assessment that I think is quite important. If you're sort of starting to lean towards, I think that this person is over control, we can go through that script to help them self-identify as over control, and that will be the final thing that helps us to get prepared for it. But we can talk about that a little bit more when we talk about commitment at some stage, or getting someone into groups. So the very final thing that I wanted to reiterate today was, I suppose, the actual 4 core deficits that we are looking for in regards to clients with over-control. So receptivity and openness is the first one. So this is high risk aversion, hypervigilance for threat, avoidance of novelty, and automatic discount of negative feedback. So that's the very first deficit that we're looking for in our assessment. We're also looking for deficits in flexible responding. So this is our compulsive need for structure and order, hyper-perfectionism, compulsive planning, rehearsal, rigid rule-governed behaviour, and moral certitude. We're also looking for deficits in emotional expression and awareness. So this could either be our inhibited expression or our disingenuous expression. So some clients won't really display too much emotion. Other clients will, I suppose, mask their emotions. A lot of my clients will smile all the time, so very disingenuous in their responses. And the final deficit is social connectedness and intimacy. So this is manifested by aloof and distant relationships, high social comparisons, bitterness, low empathy, difficulty validating. So there are 4 core deficits that we're looking for as part of assessing overcontrol. So I hope that I've been able to go over some good assessment strategies for you guys today and at least go over that a little bit. If you've got any questions, obviously ask them below or send me a message. I'll be really happy to answer. And we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.